So just recording the session so that then people can catch up later. And then also briefly introduce it. So my name is Michael. I work at Solonis as the sustainability lead for solution engineering. So using data to measure and optimize and improve sustainability of operations of companies. And so, but today, as part of Net Impact Amsterdam, I'm really happy to welcome Olivier Corradi, who is the CEO of Tomorrow and set up electricityMap, which is along a similar theme, leveraging the power of tech and data to help measure and optimize how companies and how organizations can be as sustainable as possible. And for now, yeah, first I'd just like to hand over to you, Olivier. Maybe you can introduce yourself a bit more.
Sure, and thank you for the warm welcome and the invitation. So I'm Olivier. I'm part French and part Danish. I've been studying in both countries, and my background is in engineering and mathematics. I've been studying applied statistics applied to the energy system back in the days. I worked a lot on how you can make sure that the shift from a power system that is currently dominated a lot by the production sides, we're just producing things and we're making sure that when the consumption needs some more power, then we give it to them. And the switch we're having now is that we need to make sure that the consumption follows the production, because we can't always ask for more wind or more solar when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. And so I did a lot of work in this area as an academic at the Technical University of Denmark. Then I joined IBM, where I worked a little bit on similar topics. I was as well at Google and at a French AI startup that I had the privilege to grow to 30 people. And since 5 years, I've been focused on the current startup, which is Tomorrow, that we're going to talk about after.
Yeah, thanks. So I think what's interesting for me then is, we have Tomorrow electricityMap. I think people might be a little bit familiar with that based on the introduction and the text. But can you maybe describe the circumstances that led to this idea or decision for we need this tool, we need this approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So approximately 5 years ago, I was working at this startup called Snips, where we were basically trying to build technology to enable our daily lives to be smoother. So basically build AI embedded on smartphones that would automate a lot of the tasks that you had to do. And then I took a step back and I looked a bit at the state of the world, actually quit the company in order to have enough time to really figure out what I would do next. And the biggest questions that I had were around sustainability. Namely, can we continue to grow the way we are? People are talking about climate change, but is it really such a big problem? Are we going to be able to continue growing while reducing our emissions? Can we save the world by putting more wind turbines? These type of topics. And then one topic came up, which was related to electrification. So looking at the big scheme of things, most greenhouse gases come from fossil fuels. Most fossil fuels come from the energy sector. And the biggest piece of the energy sector is, in the end, the coal that we use for electricity generation, the gas which is used for heating and electricity, and the oil that is used in transportation mainly. And in order to get rid of all those fossil fuels, most of the projections in the future showcase that we need to electrify our system. And so electricity plays a very center piece in the decarbonization. And once I got to that level of understanding, I then asked myself the question, okay, how will we decarbonize our electricity system? Especially since if you look at on energy, 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuels, and it's been the case since the 70s. Like, we haven't been able to make any progress, even though you might say that a number of headlines that we have around the world that are showcasing that now we're beating records of wind or in solar. The amount of headlines really doesn't match the reality that we're seeing in the data. And so as a data scientist, I thought, okay, maybe the first thing I should do is actually build a data visualization that just gets all this data and tries to explain a little bit where are we. And so I started building electricityMap mostly as a tool to myself in the beginning, but I also in parallel had an entrepreneurial project, which was to see how can data play a role in shaping a sustainable future. And sort of exploring both things in parallel led to create electricityMap with some core principles For me, was one principle was transparency and open source. So for example, the fact that we needed, if we really wanted to accelerate the transition to a low carbon world, we needed to make sure that as many people could contribute to a specific project, because then the company wouldn't be a bottleneck. We would be able to utilize all the resources in the world to do it. And the second piece also was, I knew this was such a controversial topic. As soon as you start talking about renewables versus nuclear, you get into a lot of the crossfires. So how can you make sure that you have something that's trustworthy? And I thought the best way to do it is just to be very transparent and humble and honest about our own limitations and say, look, this is how we build it. If you are an expert in a field and you have a better solution, or you think the numbers are incorrect, then we'll happily take suggestions. And that's really the philosophy that was behind the electricityMap when it started. And for those of you who actually don't know it, maybe it's worth doing a little bit of a quick demonstration.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think you need to enable me to screen share, apparently.
Yeah, let me do that.
Perfect. There you go. So right now you should be able to see my screen. So this is live, and this is also publicly available on electricitymap.org. And this showcases currently how many greenhouse gas are emitted for each kilowatt hour that would be consumed in a given country. So for example, I can take the example of Ireland right now, which is pretty interesting. So if I click on Ireland, you'll see on the left-hand side, list a table here of all the electricity sources. You will see that, for example, there's a lot of coal right now. The light shaded bar as a background represents the maximum theoretical production. So for example, on wind, you can see that there's very little wind production currently, but if the wind were to blow, then this small bar would actually become much, much larger because the theoretical capacity is very high. So this is probably because the wind doesn't blow currently in Ireland. And you can actually also see it from the small animation here that showcases how much the wind blows. The particles would move much, much faster if the wind was blowing in Ireland. So you can see there's a lot of gas and oil, and which means that in the end, only 16% of the electricity right now in Ireland is low carbon. And you also notice a difference because there's a renewable gauge here, there's a low carbon one. The difference is that nuclear is low carbon, but not renewable. And you might say, well, wait a minute, there's no nuclear in Ireland, but you'll see here at the bottom that there's actually imports from Great Britain. And Great Britain has some nuclear, and so that's where the discrepancy comes from. And also France, that has a lot of nuclear, is exporting to Great Britain, which is exporting to Ireland. So we take into account the whole interconnectivity of the system in order to be able to say, if you were to charge, for example, your electric vehicle right now, you would emit 550 grams of carbon for each unit of kilowatt hour that you would charge in your electric vehicle. So that's in a nutshell the project. And there was a call to action that we added very early on here, where we said, you know what, this project is open source. Here's, for transparency purposes, the data we're using, and you can contribute by adding your country. And in the beginning, I remember we only had, when I created this system, we only had France, Denmark, and Sweden, if I remember correctly. And then as the project became more popular, we had more and more people coming to the map and said, you know what, I actually know where the data for Croatia is available. Let me just add that, and I'll code the small system that gathers the data. I'll submit it to your system. And once we approved it, then the map was colored. And I actually remember someone who told me, this is so cool. It feels like being a painter that takes a brush and just paints over an empty canvas of gray countries. And now we are discovering sort of the color of the electricity as we integrate more data.
Yeah. How is your coverage now then?
So the coverage is getting better. You can see we have good pieces of Europe there. We have Latin America well covered. The Northern America part is also well covered, but the data is delayed. And on electricitymap.org, you'll only be able to see data that is at least 2 hours old. And that's mainly to be able to show a real-time picture. And if the data is more than 2 hours old, then you might see some solar production, even though it's the night. So that's really why we chose the 2 hour mark. But we are looking into building a version of electricity map that will be able to showcase historical trends over several months or years, and that would show a very good coverage. And to finalize on the coverage, we have Australia as well, thanks to some friends at OpenNEM who built a similar system as electricity map, but only for Australia, and they helped us get the coverage here for Australia. And India, Japan, Korea are different places that we're also working on. Africa has a bit of data availability problems right now because the system is not really instrumented, and you have a lot of decentralized energy resources as well.
Yeah. And so what would you say the main things you can use this for are? Like, how do people use it now? And also, what do you see as the biggest use cases in the future?
Yeah, so there's, as a citizen, I would come to this map in order to have more informed debates or to educate myself on the energy policies of various countries. So for example, the first intended use case was actually when you have a headline that says, Portugal just ran on 100% green electricity for a day, then people would then go to the map and look at the historical chart at the bottom and be like, okay, did Portugal actually run on 100% green or wind energy for a day? So that helps inform a little bit the debates that can be skewed in some directions. The second piece is on the whole renewable versus nuclear debate. There's been a lot of back and forth about saying, can we actually power a system with wind? Can we do it with nuclear? Is nuclear really low carbon? And so we take the angle of carbon emissions only here. So there's a lot of negative externalities you should count aside from just the carbon. But basically, we try to put some data and inform debate. So there's the citizen angle. Then there's the policy angle as well. So these things are made, this product is being used by, I mean, for example, the French president has been using it in discussions with the European Commission in order to explain what France is doing and how well they're performing. And of course, again, it has this nuclear component to it, but we've also had the energy ministry in Denmark using it in order to understand how effective is their performance on wind. So there's the whole policy angle that comes through here. And then there's the last piece, which is about companies, because more and more companies are building products that are tied to electricity. And there you want to be able to communicate to your consumers how clean is the electricity at the time you're consuming it. And that's actually where we built a business on top of electricity map. What happened is that roughly a year after having launched the product, one of my best friends joined and told me, you know what, this thing can actually generate some revenue because the data is worth something. And so we started building some forecasts that would predict how the whole system would behave in the next 24 hours. And we started using it in different use cases for enterprise customers. One is, if you are selling an electric vehicle, you should probably make sure that that electric vehicle is charging electricity at the time where it's the greenest. So an example is if you come home, you plug your electric vehicle, you don't want it to charge right away if maybe the wind will start blowing in a couple of hours. And we've seen that for Ireland. Right now, it's actually it's a very bad moment to charge your electric vehicle if you have one in Ireland. But maybe in a couple of hours, it will be much better. And we've seen changes by a factor of 4 just in a couple of hours because you've got a wind gust coming. So these are the things we would like to do with the electric vehicle industry. And then there's other use cases we might want to talk about after. I'll highlight one, which is our biggest customer, which is Google, that is doing the same concept of smart charging, but they do it with data centers instead. So it turns out that in data centers, everything that is not streaming, website traffic, and so on is very flexible because it represents training big AI algorithms or doing business intelligence tasks. And these tasks are not very time sensitive. I mean, if you train the YouTube recommendation algorithm a couple of hours later than it was intended, nothing is going to happen. It just means the predictions will be slightly out of date, but that's not really a problem. And so with that flexibility, you can move the jobs that are very compute intensive to times where their electricity is the greenest. And in the case of Google, because they have data centers everywhere across the world, they can also say, look, right now the data center in Ireland is right now not powered by some green electricity, but maybe another one in, say, I don't know, Austria right now is green. So let's use the Austria one instead, and they can move the jobs around spatially. So this opens up a whole range of cool use cases where, based on data, based on predictions, you can try to make sure that the consumption side of things tries to play a role in stabilizing the system and making sure that when there's excess renewables or excess low carbon electricity, that you actually use it instead of wasting it. That's really the key component.
Yeah. I'm also curious if you would take an example like Google or maybe charging your electric vehicle, how big a difference does it make if you would choose in terms of the carbon impact you have, if you would do it at, in the middle of the day versus in the middle of the night or a few hours? Have you done any kind of impact measurement on this?
Yeah, so we did at some point a study where we looked at most countries in Europe, and we looked at the difference between you as a consumer consuming electricity with the same probability as the time at which everyone else uses electricity, which means that most people use most electricity during 2 times in the day. There's the time where you wake up, there's a peak in the morning, and then there's the time where everyone gets back to work. And if you use electricity at these times compared to if you use it at the best time during the day, you can save in terms of carbon 15, 20%, depending on which country you're looking at. It depends, of course, at how much the carbon varies during a day. And if you have a country like Denmark, where there's a lot of wind, now increasingly more solar, you've got very big differences. If you have a country like, for example, France, that is powered by 80% nuclear, then you have a much, much lower variability, right? So the variability depends a lot on which country you're looking at. And of course, another example is like Poland, dominated a lot by coal power. I think 3/4 of its electricity comes from coal. And there as well, you will have very, very little volatility. It's basically always going to be consistently bad, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, and Nicholas, I see you have a question. Go ahead, you can ask it. Just unmute yourself.
Yeah. So I followed a bit the example of Google, which I find really fascinating because it's not only time flexibility, but you have this spatial flexibility, right? You decide where to use your servers, and therefore I was wondering in Europe or in other continents, have you analyzed if there's kind of a correlation or decorrelation between the wind patterns between different countries, because we often talk about time flexibility shifting in time. But is there really a case where does it happen often that there is, for example, a lot of wind in Denmark and not in Germany, or is the correlation quite strong? And in that case, you couldn't actually shift that much in space. Is it something you have done maybe?
Yeah, it's a super interesting study that we should re-update, because we did one in, I think it was 2017, where we looked at the correlation across the whole European grid. And I think you could look at the wider correlation now. If you look at the case as Google, I mean, they can basically shift things around the world, right? They're not constrained by any physical infrastructure, or at least the digital infrastructure doesn't constrain them too much. But in Europe, if I remember correctly, I think we saw a pretty high correlation. I am not going to share the number, but I can do it after because I'm not sure about the number and don't want to say anything wrong. But we were surprised at how high the correlation were, which means that the potential for flexibility is actually quite low, in the sense that when the sun shines, it shines roughly across the whole of Europe. Sure, you have a bit of a time difference and latitude difference, but it didn't pan out to too much. And the wind correlation was also pretty high, in the sense that when you have a lot of wind, everywhere where the wind potential is high, there's wind turbines. And so when the wind blows, it blows roughly in the same place. So when the Nordics are producing electricity, Germany would produce electricity, the UK would produce electricity, Ireland would be a little bit less correlated, but still you have a bit of a time delay. And that time delay is not a lot for the wind gusts to come from the west to the east. So I think the long story short is that the argument that says we will always have somewhere on the grid the wind blowing and the sun shining, I think that one is something that we haven't been able to see from the data so far. It's dangerous to rely on this.
Do you see cloud coverage having an impact on this, or is that also kind of the same everywhere? Like if it's cloudy in the Netherlands, it's cloudy in Spain as well?
That's a very good question. We actually didn't look at cloud coverage and weather patterns per se. We actually looked at the production directly. So this is taking into account the cloud coverage. And when we did an analysis, we also mixed together solar and wind. So we're basically looking at the amount of renewables that were not hydro and looking at how they correlated.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting study. I think we should do that would be a cool blog post to do.
Do you collaborate with academia on this kind of stuff?
So we do collaborate with academia. Right now, we're a small team, well, 10 people working on this, and our resources are very limited. So we haven't been able to collaborate as extensively as we would have liked to with academia. What we do currently is that we give a lot of data out, and we help a little bit on the interpretation of our methodology to enable folks who want to do similar investigations to get access to our data set and then do the investigation. So if someone from academia is listening, you can just write to us, and we tend to be we are pretty slow to respond, but we typically do respond after a while and help because it's important. I think on that topic, for me, if you really want to change the world, it starts with sort of in the causality chain. You have different angles of attack. You have the citizens that need to be educated such that they will vote for the right people, and they will pressure the companies that sell stuff to them to do it the right way. But then there's also the other piece, which is academia needs to show the way, right? They need to say, this is the way forward if you want to do something meaningful. And then really companies and policymakers are really listening to both at academia and the consumers or the citizens, right? So this is why for us it's been so important to have a free product out there, because that helps create the awareness, create the debates. And then it's also super important that we can enable academia to go as fast as possible and do the right studies, because they're also paving the way to the future, right? They're figuring out how will this future energy system look like, what's feasible and what's not.
Yeah. So Wolfram, I see you put a question in the chat. Would you like to ask it directly?
Yes, I can. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your explanations, Olivier. My internet is a bit slow. I was just wondering, well, did you see a lot of effect since you are getting and analyzing the data on, well, changed consumption patterns due to COVID and home office working? Has that had relevant effect, or is that just negligible?
So we haven't been able to do a study there. I also think that this is typically as in the previous question, it's one of the studies that would be fascinating to do, and we haven't had the resources to do it. But if I can recommend you, there was a Carbon Brief article, if I remember correctly, that looked at that and that concluded that as a whole, as in the energy system, you had a displacement from energy to electricity. And you also had more electricity being consumed that came from renewables because of the whole COVID initiative. And that is also because we're basically matching, first of all, the heavy industry doesn't operate as heavily as previously. And the heavy industry is a big driver for the dirtier fossil fuels. And if you consume electricity during the day, that's basically a good thing because the sun is shining. So basically that's the electricity system is also geared towards that. But the short answer is that I actually don't have tangible answer so far.
Mm-hmm.
Would love to have one.
Thank you very much. If I may, just a little other thought that came to mind. In the Netherlands, green hydrogen power sources are something much debated.
Yes.
Is that something that would be difficult for your model to grasp as well? It would be solar powered, but in the end it would be a different energy source. Or would you factor that in under solar?
Yeah, so are you referring to the renewable energy certification and the guarantees of origin and these type of schemes?
I'm referring to large-scale produced hydrogen by electrolysis, which is fueled by renewable, especially offshore solar and wind energy sources.
Right. So the whole question about hydrogen is actually pretty fascinating. So right now the European Union is setting a strategy for having low carbon fuels that relies a lot on creating these fuels with hydrogen, and hydrogen being actually one of the fuels as well, and doing that using excess capacity. So if there is an appealing concept of being able to decarbonize, for example, aviation and non-electricity related uses with an energy carrier, which comes from electricity. So I think it has a very high potential. Right now, the problem is that the conversion to hydrogen is pretty low efficiency. And so the cost in the end is very high, and is not at places that currently make these things commercially viable. So that's the first issue that we're encountering. The second issue is a potential for greenwashing when you want to certify that your hydrogen has been electrolyzed by renewables and excess capacity. Because right now, when you look at counting electricity and its carbon footprint, there's two ways to do it. You can look at things, at an hourly level from a physical perspective, as we do in electricityMap. And then there's another way, which is called the market-based methodology, where you can buy certificates. And these certificates are typically issued and bought on a yearly basis, so they don't take into account the hourly component. And there is work getting done right now. I could mention Energy Tag as one of the initiatives is trying to bridge that to what they call 24/7, so to the hourly basis. But long story short, if you don't take into account the temporality, the fact that you electrolyze it at a given time where the wind was blowing, then you might in the end greenwash everyone by saying, I electrolyzed something and I bought some certificates, but the wind didn't blow at that time. So it's actually coal or gas powered hydrogen, which is extremely bad for the climate.
It sounds like a place where you could offer a solution, right? Then by having the analysis based on the carbon intensity of energy production per unit of time and linking the production of hydrogen to that time and location. Like you could say, analyze the grid and say you produce this hydrogen when the carbon emissions per, megawatt hour produced was this high, and therefore you do or do not qualify for the certificate of green hydrogen.
Absolutely, and this is our vision: is to be able to provide to become the single source of truth for all carbon intensity on the grid. The real challenge that we're facing right now is that it's not the current way the system is doing. If you look at larger companies that are setting goals to become 100% renewable, they will do it using certificates that are counted on the yearly level. If you are at home and you buy a green electricity contract, it will be green, but it will be green aggregated over a year, not hour by hour. Because if you really think about it, being green every hour requires having a battery that will store all the surplus renewable and give it back to the grid every hour of the year, which is what we think everyone should be doing, right? We want to push to the direction where you do proper accounting, but the accounting rules are really not something you change from one day to the other. So we are trying to figure out what is the next best step between where we are now, which is accounting on a yearly level, and then something that is on an hourly level. And there's a lot of discussions we're having around trying to push the agenda forward, but these forces are much bigger than a 10 people startup.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I see two questions. Rick, as this is your first question, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, just on that, I would have thought large-scale hydrogen producers, not that there is any yet, but people are thinking there will be, would just be using PPAs and doing it that way. But I think what you're saying is you see problems with PPAs in terms of you feel that they're maybe greenwashing because of the time element. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so there's a whole class of instruments that allow you to allocate or to claim as green the electricity you use for example, a hydrogen electrolyzer. PPAs are one, you have guarantees of origin, and each have a different level of, let's say, impact on the system. And if you look at PPAs, for us, the way we think about things, they fall in two categories. You have PPAs that come from the local grid, and they are truly, so a PPA for everyone is a power purchasing agreement. So you're basically committing to buy electricity from a producer for a certain period of time. And then you're claiming that electricity as yours, which means that also this electricity doesn't go to others in the grid. So citizens that are connected to the grid don't get to claim anything based on that PPA, because else you would count it twice. And so if the PPA is in the same grid, you're basically making an assumption to say that the electricity can flow between the PPA producer and the consumer without any bottlenecks. And we believe that's completely fine. So this PPA, I think, should be able to be counted. However, if you have a PPA in a distant grid that is going through several bottlenecks, we believe that that's a problem. And for example, right now, it's still possible to buy PPAs from geothermal in Iceland, even though you are, for example, in the Netherlands. And for us, that's a problem because if you live in Iceland and you are paying your taxes in Iceland, you will then not receive the green geothermal electricity because it has been sold to a different country. And that's very, very counterintuitive to common understanding.
Okay, so, but it's correct, but it's kind of more of a ideological. I guess it gets into equality and things like that, but still PPA like of that form is still correct. That green benefit is not available to anybody else, including the country, and they should not be. Iceland should not be claiming anything about that power if that PPA has been sold to somebody else. Now they might do that, but then that's the problem. It's not the problem of the PPA structure. It's the problem that people maybe try to claim things on top of that aren't correct. And you feel that's unfair as well, that they should be able to claim that perhaps?
Yeah, I think if we take a step back, the way we're thinking about it is we're looking at a accounting system that needs to be designed, and what are the principles of a good accounting system. And this is where the debate is, and my opinion of a good accounting system is one that is intuitive, that everyone understands. And if we have something where there's a misunderstanding possible, then that leads the way to potentially do double counting and wrong claims. But I totally agree with you that the culprit is using the accounting system correctly is what we all need to do. And then some systems are easier to implement and to understand, right?
Yeah, because a big company like Google or Amazon with their PPAs globally in data centers and other activities, they are definitely using those kind of mechanisms.
Absolutely.
That a wind farm might be in a completely different part of the world than because of various reasons than a data center that's in another part of the world. And so I guess there are many challenges with that. So thanks for that.
But actually, I want to piggyback on what you said, because we could take the case of Google as an extremely interesting example, because they were previously 100% renewable using PPAs that they bought across the world. They didn't do any temporal matching, and they didn't do any spatial matching. So they could match consumption with a PPA that was in a distant grid and even produce at a different time. And now the thing they announced it as they want to be 24/7 low carbon powered every hour of the year by 2030. And they still count the PPAs, but they will only count it if it's generated in the hour where they consume it, and if it's generated on the same grid as the assets that are consuming electricity. So it's interesting to see that Google is starting to constrain themselves to this.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. I'll just finish quickly. I definitely agree with the first one of, and I think that's the way it operates in Australia, for example, is that it does need to be consumed at the time it was generated. And I think most good PPAs do that anyway. But the second one is definitely an interesting factor. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just thinking as well, the time limitation is very important, because otherwise you're not fixing the fundamental problems of lack of storage that you have in the grid, and you're kind of just navigating around that. And
yeah, I think good PPAs do that fairly, the really good ones do that well. They will not let someone, you're on a contract to provide the power to sort of in a theoretical way to somebody, and you have to meet their demand. And you have to get it from your own facility or somewhere else if you want to trade it, because of the wind's not blowing or something. Or you have to have batteries. These are the alternatives for a PPA contract provider in the really good PPA. So the time, I think, can be met well, but I completely understand the grid one now. Interesting one.
And also previously, I mean, just furthering the discussion here, previously, a lot of the arguments for not necessarily looking at temporality and spatiality was also that we didn't have the information available. And I think the value add that we believe we can bring and provide is now having the data to be able to make sure that we can put a minimum level of quality to all those claims that are happening around the world, because all PPAs are not bad, quite the contrary. Like PPAs are actually quite good in financing more renewable infrastructure. And if we can provide that minimum standard, then we make sure that the money goes in the right places. And sometimes in some places, installing a wind turbine is not the solution. You should rather install storage systems or interconnectors. And these are the things that start getting highlighted when you look at spatial restrictions and time restrictions.
Yeah. So I think, Salome, you have a question?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I found your tool online and I was really interested about it. We are even gonna just mention something about it in our magazine. I work for VDE FNN. That's we call it technical regulator in Germany. So we have working groups that develop technical rules for the grid, and you could say we are responsible for the grid codes in Germany. And this is more maybe of a personal question. I would just like to hear, to hear what you think about it as a normal, customer, as a citizen. Yeah, I have to pay a lot for electricity as I live in Germany, and I know about the developments for the smart metering system in Germany and how complicated it is, and it's like a mismatch of a lot of ideas of what we could achieve, and we will have time of day tariffs someday, but as a normal person that rents an apartment, I don't have PV panels, I don't have an electric car. I think I'm the majority, I would say. I don't have any incentive to look at electricity map and say, oh, okay, I should then use my electricity at this time of the day. First, because I don't have that that incentive from the tariffs, and sorry. And secondly, because my electricity bill is not that big, and in the end, the price of electricity is so high that I don't see really in Germany that happening for a long time, that normal people are gonna be caring about this at all. And I know that in other countries it's different, but I just would like to hear what you think about this. I feel it's a huge mismatch of the reality that people live. That's, I understand this, that they don't have an interest in this.
Absolutely, I think it's an excellent point, and something we discovered as well with electricity map is that we were able to increase a little bit the awareness on something that is, let's say, normally very boring. I think when I talk to like my parents about electricity, they really don't care about it. For them, electricity is a bill. They flip on the switch when they want the lights, they want to turn on the oven, and that's it. So it's also very technical. It's like kilowatt hours, kilowatts, like what's the difference? I don't even understand it. Like it's the power of the light bulb, whatever. So it's something that's very uninteresting for most people. And what we've tried to do is to basically turn it to something interesting. We also realized that because right now, for many political reasons, the price incentives are not really there, as you mentioned, the tariffs are not there. So as a electric vehicle owner, even if I consume a lot of electricity from my electric vehicle, I won't be able to save a lot of money on a year if I were to charge it at the optimal time. However, what we realized is that you have more and more people who actually care about the greenness of things. They will never go through the pain of choosing by themselves when to charge their electric vehicle. That's too manual, that's too cumbersome, and they're not motivated enough. However, if E.ON or someone else as part of their offering enables them to have like automatic charging at a specific time, which reduces their footprint, they will almost certainly always want that option as an add-on, because it's, if you can take care of the convenience problem. So the price incentive is typically not huge. I actually wish it would be higher. I think it makes sense that it becomes higher. But then it's really about all the actors in the value chain before you get to the citizen, they need to take action. And if you look at a company like, for example, Google, it doesn't, like the electricity price itself might not, is actually a big incentive for them because they use so much of it, right? And they are one of the key players you want to push if you want to green the grid. And then for the electric mobility, we're talking about all the charging station providers. They have to really build up these systems. I hope this answers a little bit your question on the incentives and, you know, whether or not people care so much.
Maybe follow-up question, sorry to jump in, but do you see a potential business model where companies could offset some of their emissions by paying consumers to use more green electricity by timing their activities differently? So a consumer would receive money from a company to charge their car 2 hours later, for example, and thereby offset some of the company's own impact.
So I believe it will happen at some point. The question is really, how does the business case look like? And then it boils down to what is the value, business value of reducing carbon? And right now, the carbon price is still very low, that companies don't really have an incentive, like a monetary incentive, to reduce carbon emissions, and therefore to be at the level to which they would pay consumers to change their behavior. But if you step aside from carbon emissions for a second and you look at the electricity grid, there are some regions in the world where you get paid to turn off some appliances at times where the grid needs to be stabilized. And if you fast forward to a world where everyone has an electric vehicle, or there's a couple of electric vehicles on the same street and they all charge at the same time, I can guarantee you that there's going to be a price incentive for you not to charge your electric vehicle at the same time as everyone else, because else the grid is going to have to be extended, and that's costing a lot of money. So if we can make sure we can reuse the old grid and pay people instead of installing new systems, that seems to me like a clever solution. And that is currently already things that are, you know, happening across the world.
Yeah, can I just add a couple of quick things that might help Salome as well? Is unfortunately in Germany, you kind of been handcuffed a little bit by the failure of the smart meters. Unfortunately, they've had a really bad or no smart meter rollout in Germany, and go and look up Google why. But that's really created a big impediment. So Germany is a long way behind many other countries with being able to even just know what's going on the grid and what people are using, and let alone have control of it. So talk to your local politicians, get them moving on smart grids. I know they're talking about it, but it's really important that Germany gets a smart meter rollout going properly. So that's a big impediment. But even with what you're doing now, sure, you won't get a price signal, but if you have a washing machine, a dishwasher, a dryer, maybe you've decarbonized and you've got heat pumps instead of gas boilers or something. But there are many things you could do just by looking at that if you wanted to, if you're really motivated. Obviously, it's only going to be highly motivated people who do something. But you have complete choice about when you wash your clothes. You have complete choice about when you wash your dishes. Many things you can move around if you are suitably motivated. And as Olivier says, new models will spring up very quickly once the price signal's there to enable you to do those things in a set and forget way. So you won't have to think about, oh, I need to put my, wash my dishes at a certain time. I need to charge my car at a certain time. The services that will spring up extremely quickly will do all of that for you. All you'll have to do is tell them what your values are. I really like to have as much green power as I can, or I really like to support the grid and in a stability as much as I can, or only a little bit. And it will just do, the algorithms will take care of all of it for you and you won't even notice. So that's the world that we're heading for.
Yeah, I still see a mismatch. That's not my reality, because I don't know anyone who that I know in my circle that owns a car. Like, young people don't buy necessarily electric cars or buy a house where they can install a heat pump and all this. So there's also the conversation in Germany that electric cars will cause more grid constraints, and at the same time they might receive incentives, so they help with the grid stabilizing the grid. But a big chunk of the population is left behind in some way, and they will keep paying for these Energiewende. And yeah, that's so more my personal point of view. But thanks for your answers.
I think you do bring up a key point, which is about equality and who's paying for the transition. And you know, if just for a second, if we play around with the idea that the price incentive is there to consume electricity at the optimal times, you will also leave behind people that do not exhibit the flexibility, right? If the price becomes very, very high, as we saw in Texas, for example, then what do you do if you do not have the capacity to install a storage system or to move ahead your consumption? So I think this is a key question, both on the production side, which is when you install more renewable, you need more grid infrastructure as well, storage and so on, who pays for it? And then also, how do you expose the right price signals? Do you need to be able to enable some people that do not want to be exposed to the volatility of the price to still get a flat price, so they are guaranteed to not be exposed to the risk, right? All these questions are very complicated questions that I think are currently not satisfactorily addressed in.
Okay. Maybe in the interest of time, as we're already a bit over, there are two final questions in the chat. So we can go through them and then start to round it off. But the one from Wolfram is about, you know, national grid operators often have cross-border trading, and how, as electricityMap, you integrate all these aspects and also more generally ensure that the insights are valid and reliable.
Correct. That's a very good question. So we take into account the interconnectors in what we call the flow tracing model. So just to paint a picture of the problem we're looking at here is, if you have a country such as Denmark that imports their electricity from a neighboring country, say Sweden, then you need to take into account how the electricity in Sweden is generated. If you want to be able to say, when I'm in Denmark and I charge my Tesla, where does the electricity come from? What's its impact? But the key thing is also that Sweden might import electricity from Poland. So you also need to take into account the electricity in Poland, which impacts the electricity in Sweden, which impacts the electricity in Denmark. And then if you really want to make it complicated, you can actually have Poland that imports from Germany, which imports from Denmark. So now you have a closed loop where the electricity is imported in a chain in a circular fashion. So all of this can be solved mathematically using a balance equation that's called the flow tracing. And we actually have an article on our blog post that tries to give a non-technical intuition about how this thing works. But the long story short, to give a bit of intuition, is that it works, any interconnector works a little bit in the same way that if you were to mix two liquids together. So you basically are receiving electricity from Sweden, you're receiving electricity, there's electricity produced locally. And if you mix both of them, then as a consumer, you get a mix of both. And when you export electricity, because you cannot direct electrons, you're not able to say which type of electron you're going to export. You can only export the mix of both, right? So there's just you export half of something and half of something else, for example. And with these two rules, then you can set up these balance equations that are actually pretty well known in the academic world since many years. And that's the way we solve things on electricityMap. So it actually means that if you change something in Spain, it will impact the results in every connected country on the European grid, because the whole system is completely interconnected. So that's the first part of the answer. And I think that the next piece of the question was, how do we make sure that this is actually reliable? And so there's reliability on the methodology. And this is why we try to be as transparent as possible, just publish everything, because then people will certainly yell at us if we don't do things correctly, and then we can take that feedback and change it. But then there's another piece, which is that the data we need to ingest needs to be of high quality, because else it's just garbage in and garbage out. So we try to make sure to have very strict quality standards on what is getting ingested into a system from National Grid, from Energinet, from all the different data providers across Europe or across the world, to make sure that the data is reliable and trustworthy.
That's good. Also, before I go into the last question, on a side note, if you want to, collaborate with Olivier and tomorrow, feel free to contact him or us after the session, like Salome with your article or Rick with the standards that you're going into. And so the final part, this is from Jacqueline. Would you like to ask it or should I read it out?
I can ask it, thank you. So my question, and we can also take it offline, is right now you've got an overview of the national level. Presumably you do bespoke work for clients like Google. At what point would it be possible or feasible, excuse me, to look at it at, say, a hospital level, for example, or to apply this visualization tool to other applications?
That's an excellent question. So our vision is to be able to get there. Like we want to be able to get to answer the question of how clean is the electricity at any time, at any grid point, at any power socket, you might say. Now, we are bridging now the gap, which is from national to regional as the data becomes available. For example, if you look on electricityMap, we have Norway and Italy, which have been broken into their own so-called bidding zones, but basically independently controlled areas. And there's a different color for each of them, even though the colors are very similar because the interconnectors play a big role. And the technology we have can scale down to the hospital level. We just need the data. And I think the data is really complicated because the different actors are not necessarily ready to share it, but also sometimes they actually don't have it. It needs to be instrumented correctly. But this is certainly the world we need to live in. The more we have distributed energy resources, the more we have local constraints because we have a lot of electric vehicles or other types of electricity assets. Basically, the whole transition to an electricity-based energy world requires details and understanding in the details. So hopefully we can get there, but it will take a bit of time.
So you need the quality, the transparency, because I just think working in a hospital myself, that there are so many processes which we can schedule for other times, the charging of equipment, sterilization, you name it, that it's such a great practical way, especially for hospitals who have already reached a high standard and want to push through the frontier even further. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really nice question, Jacqueline. So to round off, Olivier, is there anything else you would like to share or talk about that we haven't asked you yet?
I think this was a very interesting discussion. Maybe to wrap up, sort of one interesting thought that I wanted to share is that we've, in all the initiatives that I've seen, entrepreneurial initiatives that are trying to tackle climate change, we've been faced with one big challenge, which is that we were not able to distinguish the difference between the climate challenge and the customer challenge, because we want to fix a problem, which is the climate. However, there's not necessarily a business model that pays you to fix that problem right now, because else the problem would already be solved, I would say, with a very high carbon tax, for example. And it is important for other entrepreneurs as well to realize that both are very different and they need to be tackled differently. And then you have to pick a subset of climate problems and a subset of customer problems that are the same and that align. And this is an ongoing topic of discussion at tomorrow and something that I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, thanks. That's a common problem you see as well. You know, where is the business model? Where can we quantify the financial benefits of what we do? It's getting better and better, but we still see there's a long way to go before what's good for the planet is the same as what's good for every company within it that operates within its boundaries. Okay. So I'd like to close off, like, Olivier, really thanks so much for coming in, sharing your experience, your product and the work you're doing. And thanks everyone else for dialing in and asking some really interesting and engaging questions. I really enjoyed this discussion and I hope you all did as well. And we see you again at another Net Impact Amsterdam session or event that we organize. With this, you can close it. Thanks everyone and have a nice weekend already.
Thank you, Michael, for organizing.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
This was good. Thank you for organizing. I really liked it. I will head out and get some lunch but I wish you a very